fathers of the Reformation, but when you read it's really, yeah, it's a little different than yeah, when they're calling him a father of the Reformation. He's kind of an interesting character.
Well, a forerunner. I don't know if they called him a father of the Reformation, but
Yeah,
I mean he was about this at the time of Luther and Zwingli, but he didn't actually break away from the church.
yeah,
But anyway,
interesting.
all right. So this is a TH109 Modern Church History, and this course is the objective is to gain a firm understanding of the past 4 centuries of the church, its culture, its revivals, and its accomplishments. To study the development of Christianity after the Protestant Reformation, Christianity in the Americas, including a study of various revivalists and the era known as Protestantism, and we'll also get into the area, I meant to put Pentecostalism, the era known as Pentecostalism and the charismatic movement. That's a misprint um, on that syllabus page. But anyway, as in all of our courses, it's 3 credit hours. Um, the Church in History book, um, we're beginning basically in chapter 31 for this course. So in the Church in History book, in this book, I'll need to get one for you for next week. I might have one in my van, but I'll make sure I get one to you. But anyway, beginning in chapter 31 to the end of the book is basically what you should read in the Church in History book. The other book that you should have is God's Generals, the Revivalists by Robert Slaridan. Roberts wrote several God's Generals books. This one is focused on some of what he refers to as the Revivalists. And there's, I think, 5 different key people, Wesley included, and I think Wesley Finney and Billy Graham, I think, is one of the 5 people that are in that book. So that's a very good read. All right, so the course objectives or the course requirements, of course, is to read the required text, attend the classes, or watch online if you miss any class, and take the required exam at the end, at the last night of the class. And there's additional graduate level student information there. All right, so let's go to our lesson number 1 of this course. We're focused right now. We're focused on the 17th century Christianity in England, and we're beginning with where we left off in the previous course. The previous course we talked about the Protestant Reformation, and it was, other than the first 2 or 3 lessons, it was pretty much entirely on the 16th century. Everybody we talked about, we spent like 4 weeks talking about Luther, and then we talked about Zwingli and Calvin and the Anabaptists. All of that were events and people and things taking place in the 16th century. So now we leave the 16th century and we go into the 17th century, and there was a lot happening in the 17th century, specifically in England. And we'll talk about some of the other areas outside of England in the next couple of sessions. But primarily for this session, we're focused on 17th century Christianity in England specifically. Now, the church in England struggles in the 16th and 17th century. The Reformation in England is prolonged. Reformation in England was more political than spiritual and stressed organization more than doctrine. And we talked about how the church, the Protestant church or the Reformed church, began in England. It didn't start there the same way it did anywhere else. It was completely political because King Henry VIII wanted to make himself the head of the church, but didn't change any of the theology or the doctrines or anything else in the church. And then through the 16th century, it went back and forth from Protestant or friendly towards Protestantism to more against Protestantism, depending on who the king or the queen was. But and we saw how through Cranmer and Knox and others, the mighty influence of Calvin became strongly embedded in the Protestant movement of um, of England. And so the influence of Calvin is felt during the reign of Bloody Mary, which we talked about a few weeks ago. Many Protestants left England and went to Geneva, where Calvinism was very strong, and they returned when Elizabeth became queen. After Mary died, her sister Elizabeth became queen, and she was much more friendly towards the Protestant movement. And under Elizabeth, these Protestants returned to England, and upon returning, they were fired up with enthusiasm and zeal. And I mean, they basically had spent a few years in next to paradise, probably in Geneva, where Protestantism was fully embraced. And so they returned to England now that Elizabeth is queen, and they're full of enthusiasm and zeal for the ideas and ideals of Calvin. The Puritans desire to reform the Church of England. Okay, so we have the Church of England, but there are some specific people in the Church of England that are referred to as the Puritans. Now, these were members of the Church of England wishing to see a purified, or wishing to see it purified more thoroughly, and they were called the Puritans. They didn't break away from the church. Eventually, they were forced out, but it kind of reminds me of Erasmus and who was that other guy that we talked about, Lefebvre, who basically were reform minded, but they stayed within the Catholic Church. And the Puritans were kind of like that. They wanted the church to be more Protestant and more Presbyterian. They didn't like the Episcopal form of church government, but they wanted to stay within the Church of England. And they wanted to see installed in every parish an earnest, spiritually minded pastor able to preach. They demanded the abolition of clerical dress, kneeling at communion, the use of the sign of the cross, and other things too. And as time went on into the 16th century, or I should say into the 17th century, that's another misprint. Greater demands were voiced. Sorry about that flickering light we have here. I wanted to read a little bit out of the book here. Let me find my notes. Okay, in clerical dress, in the clerical dress then in use, they saw the claim of the clergy to powers which reminded them of the power of the Catholic priest. So they didn't want the clergy of the Episcopalian Church or the Church of England to wear the type of robes and garb that the Catholic priests would wear. In kneeling at the Lord's Supper, they saw the adoration of the physical presence of Jesus as taught in the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation. The ring ceremony, they even had a problem with the ring ceremony at weddings. They said that it signified to them the claim of Catholics that marriage is a sacrament. The sign of the cross at baptism was to them the Catholic superstition, or a Catholic superstition. They wished to see the church purified of the old leaven of Catholicism. And before long, they went further in their demands for purification of the church. They wished to see that in each parish, elders chosen to exercise discipline. So the purifications, the Puritans are what we might call, at least to some extent, legalists. they very strict discipline, very strict in do's and don'ts. They wish to have the ministers chosen by the people and the office of bishop abolished. All ministers, they believe, should be on equal footing. This amounted to a demand for the Presbyterian form of church government in place of the Episcopalian form. Now, you guys, I don't know if you guys understand those terms or not, but Presbyterian comes from the Greek word for elder. An elder is a presbyter. That's the Greek word. So when we talk about the Presbyterian form of church government, we're talking about a church that is run by elders. When we talk about Episcopalian, Episcopal or episkopos is the Greek word for bishop. Okay, so Episcopalian form of church government is the kind where you have a bishop in charge of several churches. All right, so there ultimately, and we'll get into this probably in a future lesson, but ultimately there ends up being four different kinds of church government. There's the Episcopalian form of church government, or Episcopal form of church government, where the bishops run several churches or oversee several churches. There's the Presbyterian form of church government, where the elders run the church, and they usually have a pastor, but the pastor is usually anyway submitted to the elders. And there's the Congregationalist form of church government, where the everything's got to be voted on by the congregation, or most things anyway. And then there's the pastoral form of church government, where the pastor runs the show. So there's basically four different kinds of church government that we see in church history as well as in current churches.
Ken, based on the scripture and the study, which of these do you think would be most like what we see in the early church?
Well, I would say it's a cross between the Presbyterian and the pastoral. Okay? In other words, the first churches that were started by Paul, when he went on his first missionary journey, he established churches, and it says he ordained elders in every church. It doesn't say anything about him ordaining pastors, but he ordained elders in every church. So initially, the first churches that Paul started had elders. It doesn't say how many, but at some point, he didn't have, and I've been making this point to my elders recently, that the Paul didn't have a blueprint on how to start churches. So and there was none. So he went around and started converting people to Christ, and before he would leave town, he would ordain elders. At some point, usually one of those elders would emerge as the lead elder, we could say, or at some point, like the Corinthian church and other churches got so messed up, they needed a pastor. They needed an overseer. But the word pastor is only found once in the New Testament, and I'm convinced that the word bishop in the New Testament is what we would call a pastor. All right. I've noticed that if the pastor is, this is a question I asked myself several years ago. If the pastor is such an important role, why isn't it talked about in the New Testament? And why do we have a list of requirements for bishops, elders, and deacons, but for nothing else? Why isn't there a list of requirements for a pastor or an evangelist or apostle? But those three offices, bishop, elder, and deacon, now some people argue that they're the same office, and that may be, but I don't think so. But those are the only three ministries, we could say, that have a list of requirements, and they're the only three that are referred to as offices. He does use the word office when referring to those three positions. So those are the three, I believe, that are the offices of a local congregation. The others, apostles, evangelists, prophets, and some teachers, are more of a traveling ministry or a ministry to the church overall. But in the local congregation, running a local congregation, you need the bishop, which is what we would call a pastor, the elders, and the deacons. And the elders usually take care of the spiritual stuff or oversee the spiritual stuff, and the deacons oversee the more manual or physical day-to-day functions that need to be done. So it's kind of hard to answer that. And one point that I was making is the New Testament seems rather vague as far as what the proper form of church government is. It mentions these different offices, but it doesn't tell us who they are or what they do. It doesn't specify the functions of these different offices. I wish you could go to just,
That would have been nice.
1 Corinthians chapter 17 or Acts chapter 29, and Paul lays out
There you go.
the proper form of church government. But all these different roles are mentioned, but I came to the conclusion that God is a God of grace, and He's less interested in these things than we are. He's less concerned about our form of church government than we are. I think a lot of times we make a big deal out of things. We make a secondary thing the main thing when it really isn't that important.
I think he's more concerned with the body,
Right.
and how we minister to each other.
Amen. So anyway, there's basically these four forms of church government, but some churches, I would say, probably have a kind of a combination or a mixture of a couple different, or a cross between a couple of these.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, I don't want to get too sidetracked on that. Let's, where did I leave off here? Letter D, right? Thomas Cartwright became the leader of the Puritan movement. He was a loyal Anglican, but because of his commitment to the Bible, he was fiercely dedicated to Puritan worship and theology and opposed government control of the church. They wanted the church to stay, the Puritans wanted the church to stay united, but they didn't want, they didn't want bishops, but they also didn't want the king or the queen to be the head of the church. Thomas Cartwright was a theological professor at the University of Cambridge, but his chief opponent was a man by the name of Bishop John Whitgift.
Mm-hmm.
He was the chief opponent to the Puritans, and he caused Cartwright to be deprived of his professorship. So after he lost his position as professor, he lived a life of wandering and persecution. He continued to labor for the cause of Presbyterian Puritanism, I guess we could say, but was running from persecution. And part of his life during this season was, I did a little bit more research on him, and he actually went to France and spent some time with the Huguenots. He actually pastored a church on some island somewhere. I forgot the name of the island. But he was in and out of England quite a bit during this time, but didn't stay in England for very long because he wasn't very popular there, at least by the government. There's another group called the Separatists. Now, the Separatists in some ways were very similar to the Puritans, but they wanted to leave the Church of England, and they're also known as dissenters, Congregationalists, and Independents. And I see it's almost like history repeating itself. The Puritans are kind of like Erasmus and Lefebvre, trying to reform from within the church, and the Separatists were more like Luther and Calvin, who break away from the church and see no good in staying within the church. Although with Luther, he left not by his own choice; he was excommunicated. But many people try to reform the church from within, and other people see the pointlessness of doing that and just break away from the church and worship outside the church. But anyway, the Separatists are known as dissenters, Congregationalists, and Independents. They believe that no local church should have anything to say about another local church. And in America, the Pilgrims who established Plymouth Rock in 1620, they were Separatists. And then in 1629, a few years later, the Puritans came and established the Massachusetts Bay Colony. I think a lot of people think that the Pilgrims were Puritans, but technically they were Separatists, and there is a difference. Perhaps a minimal difference, but there is a difference. The Puritans gained the upper hand in England. For almost 40 years after the death of Elizabeth, the Puritans were opposed and persecuted in the Long Parliament in 1620. Presbyterian Puritans finally found themselves in majority. Now, by the Long Parliament, I wondered what I got that phrase from this textbook, but of course I wanted to know why it was called the Long Parliament. It was called the Long Parliament as opposed to the Short Parliament. I thought maybe it was named after maybe some leader by the name of Long, but it was the longest session. You know, usually the Parliament is in session for a few months, not for the full year. They're in session for certain months, but this session apparently went on for a few years. It wasn't just a few months. It was a very long session of Parliament, and so it was dubbed the Long Parliament. And it began in 1640. And at this point, probably one reason why it continued for a long period of time, finally the Puritans were the majority in Parliament. And it was quite an accomplishment, and they wanted to make a lot of changes. So they just kept meeting and kept adjusting the politics of things. So immediately they set themselves the task of cleaning house, and they beheaded two of their chief opponents. A good Christian thing to do, right? And King Charles didn't like the turn of events, and King Charles decided to seize on a charge of high treason the 5 members of Parliament who were the leaders of the opposition. The House of Commons refused to give them up. The king resolved to use military force to compel Parliament to submit, and he left London and raised the royal flag at Nottingham. And with this act, he plunged England into civil war. So what happens now is there's a major, beginning in 1640, a major civil war in England. It goes for, I think, 30 years, if I remember correctly. But on the side of the king were the majority of the nobles and the country gentlemen, but because of their daring horsemanship, the king's men were called cavaliers. On the side of Parliament were the shopkeepers, small farmers, and a few men of high rank. Because the king's cavaliers wore long flowing locks, those opposing them wore their hair closely chopped or cropped, and they became known as the Roundheads.
Huh.
Okay. Again, that's from the textbook. All right. So another person, Oliver Cromwell, becomes a leader in England. He's one of the great characters of history and showed great skill and courage. In his late 20s, he believed that he was dying, and he saw many doctors, and he suffered great depression. But something happened when he was at his lowest point. The details, I couldn't find any details on it, but apparently with the help of a Puritan, he was brought to salvation. So during a very low season in his mid to late 20s, I think it was, he was converted, and something happens and awakens him spiritually. He gets elected to Parliament, and he opposes Charles on many issues, and he becomes a leader in an army. Cromwell, okay, so the struggle for a Christian kingdom in England. Cromwell, his army is known as Cromwell's Ironside, or his regiment, and they were never defeated. His Ironside regiment was composed entirely of men of religion, is how it's worded in the textbook, men of religion, who didn't swear nor drink. And I think I don't know how often they fought or how much they fought, but it stresses that they were never defeated. Cromwell was very spiritually minded at this point, and he was, with every crisis, he turned to the Bible. And he encouraged all his men to do that. It was so successful that at some point they create an army of 21,000 men, patterned after the Ironside, the Ironsides, and it was organized also by Cromwell, and it was called the New Model. The new model was a body of religious enthusiasts such as the world had not seen since the days of the Crusades. Most of the soldiers in this army were fervent, God fearing, psalm singing Puritans. When not fighting, they studied the Bible, prayed, and sang hymns. Probably not too much like our current our U.S. Army. But anyway, this is the new model. This is the army that Cromwell created for England, and he eventually emerged as the top military person in England. Okay, and we'll come back to Cromwell in a minute, but a side journey to talk about the Westminster Assembly. While war was running its course, Parliament was still meeting, and they set to the task of making changes in the church. In 1643, it abolished the episcopal form of church government, and it called an assembly of 121 clergymen and 30 laymen to provide a new creed and a form of church government. This Westminster Assembly continued, or it contained a few Episcopalians and Congregationalists, but the overwhelming majority were Presbyterian Puritans. So what form of church government do you think they adopted? Obviously, they went with a Presbyterian form of church government. So since the Scots were giving aid in the war, some of the Scots were given a seat in the Westminster Assembly. Now, they didn't have any voting rights in the Assembly, but they were there to give their views and express their opinions, and they were listened to, and their views were considered. But the Westminster Assembly turned out to be one of the history-making assemblies of the church. It prepared a directory of worship to replace the Episcopal Episcopal Prayer Book. This order of worship is still used in Orthodox Presbyterian and Congregational churches today. So for now, anyway, Protestantism dominates, and the king eventually surrenders, and he's tried and found guilty as a tyrant, a traitor, and a murderer, and public enemy, and he was condemned to death. And on January 30th, 1649, Charles I ascended the scaffold in front of the royal palace in London, and with a great multitude assembled, they witnessed his execution. He was beheaded, and it was Charles that arrested him. I'm sorry, Charles was arrested by Cromwell's leadership, and the Presbyterian Puritan Parliament arrested him for fighting God's will. He faced 68 judges, handpicked by the army, and he was sentenced to death by beheading. One objective was to end the monarchy and to only have the country run by the Parliament and the army. The army then, under Cromwell's leadership, so they've done away with the monarchy. There is a Charles II, but Charles II isn't allowed to take the throne. He actually runs off to Ireland, and but eventually he'll come back. But anyway, they did away with the monarchy, so now the army attacks the Catholic Ireland, responsible for the martyrdom of 4,000 Protestants. Cromwell returned to England to a hero's welcome, and he was named Lord Protector of England. England had practically become a military dictatorship. Under Cromwell's rule, there was a large measure of religious liberty, and all religious bodies, especially all the nonconformists and dissenters, um, Cromwell even befriended the Quakers, who were, generally speaking, hated of all men. We'll talk about the Quakers, I think, next week, um, and a few other groups. But since the beginning of the Civil War, however, some 2,000 members of the Episcopal clergy had been deprived of their means of livelihood and had suffered great hardship. So Cromwell promoted freedom of religion, but the Presbyterian Puritan Parliament didn't agree. So now there's it was Cromwell and the Parliament on one side and the monarchy on the other. Now Cromwell and his army is on one side, and Parliament is on the other. Cromwell sincerely wanted freedom of religion. He didn't want to choose. He didn't want to make everybody part of the Anglican Church or part of a Puritan church or a Presbyterian church. He wanted religious freedom. But Parliament, on the other hand, at this point was Presbyterian Puritan, and they wanted all the churches of England to come in line with that. Like all the other like all the other countries were doing. You know, if you were in Germany, you were Lutheran. If you were in France, you were Huguenot, probably, or Catholic. Um, but they wanted all the Protestants to come under the heading of the Presbyterian Puritans. But so that caused a rift between Cromwell and Parliament. The Puritan Parliament demanded religious freedom from the oppressive monarchy, but was unwilling to grant the same for others who disagreed with their Presbyterian Puritan views. In 1653, Cromwell marches an overwhelming number of soldiers into Parliament and disbanded it by force. The full establishment of a Presbyterian Church of England was unacceptable. And so then he went from church to church asking ministers to send men of pious, spiritually minded men to form a new parliament, a parliament of saints. Sounds like a great idea, right?
Yeah.
And apparently it didn't work out. It lasted less than 1 year, and there was a lot of fussing and fighting among them. And it went back to the old ways. So many of the old parliaments people that he had chased out, some of them ended up coming back, but it became a mess. But anyway, he was offered the title of king, and he was offered a crown, but he refused it. I mean, in essence, he was king. He just didn't have that title, and he didn't want to wear a crown. But he was ruling the country, we could say, like a king. All right, then we come to the Restoration of 1660. After Cromwell's death in 1658, his son Richard was unable to lead for whatever reason. Charles II is returned, and Charles II becomes king. And almost 600 changes, about 600 changes were made in the directory of worship and prayer book. So in other words, the pendulum swings back the other direction. Now the king is in charge of the government and therefore in charge of the church again. 2,000 Presbyterian clergymen refused to conform and were driven from their parishes. This didn't stop them from preaching, though. They continued to preach in homes and in barns. So Parliament passed a law forbidding them to preach, or forbidding more than 5 unrelated people in a home or barn. All this did was drove the independents out into the woods to worship. And this gave rise to the 5 Mile Act, which made it illegal for any church service led by a nonconformist within 5 miles of any town or village in England. So anyway, breach of these acts was punishable by prison, confiscation of property, or even death. And there's a group called the Covenanters, which were the Scottish Protestants, the Covenanters, and many of them were hanged or drowned without mercy. Church history is such a wonderful story, isn't it? Anyway, but this last page, I put down here some true heroes of the faith. Hopefully, this is a little bit more. Um, Cromwell accomplished a lot in favor of Protestantism, but I'm not sure that doing it by the sword is God's way of doing it. It kind of reminds me of um, Constantine and a lot of the other people that we talked about in the past. But anyway, John Bunyan was a good man, and he served against the king in the civil wars. But later he becomes a traveling preacher. Now he attended church pretty much all his life, but as he tells it in his early life, his childhood, teen years, and early 20s, he would go to church on Sunday but live like the devil the rest of the week. And sometimes, he would go to church Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night, but still was quite a sinner through much of his young life. And sometimes he would say he would hear some sermons that were great sermons, and he was determined to clean up his life, but would fail miserably. That probably sounds familiar to many of us. But he said that sin and corruption would pour out of his life like water poured out of a fountain. But he started reading some books, including Luther's commentaries on Romans and Galatians, which he started to get an understanding of what righteousness means and grace and these principles that we teach a lot here. John Bunyan, as I understand it, is probably the greatest grace preacher that I could see in England in the 17th century. He really, it took him a while to get there, but once he got there, he really understood what it was all about. And he said that once he heard the words, "Thy righteousness is in heaven," and he realized Jesus Christ is his righteousness. And, it's not a matter of trying to achieve something that you already have by faith. Salvation and righteousness is by grace through faith. Bunyan wrote, no matter what he was doing or where he was righteous because Jesus Christ is his righteousness. He said once he truly understood righteousness, most temptations seemed to fade away. He said, we fulfilled the law, by him rose from the dead, by him got victory over sin, by him. He was arrested and convicted of having abstained from going to church and thrown in jail. You didn't know you could be thrown in jail for not going to church, right? Well, he didn't go to the official government church, so he was thrown in jail. And while lingering in jail for 12 years, he wrote his famous Pilgrim's Progress. Have any of you read Pilgrim's Progress?
I think wasn't it a movie? I think I saw the movie. Yeah, this is a movie.
If it wasn't a movie, it should be a movie.
Yeah, I think.
I'll have to look into that. If it is a movie, I want to see it.
Hagen,
Maybe we'll show it
I think
someday.
John Hagen, I think.
Maybe we could watch it for extra points.
Oh, maybe. All right. All right. Another Puritan, a man of high rank, excellent education, and rare gifts was John Milton. John Milton. In blindness, loneliness, and poverty, he wrote Paradise Lost, another great Christian epic poem. And as a result of persecution, the Puritans now became a party outside the Church of England, and they had been a group who wished to stay in the Church of England and reform it, but now they were forced into a position where they were taken, really began to look more like the separatists. And they too had become dissenters. All right, Catholicism. Okay, Charles II had become king. Charles II had got to his, he was on his deathbed in 1685, and all his life he had wavered between unbelief and superstitious Catholicism. And in the end, on his deathbed, he professed the Roman Catholic faith. And he was succeeded by his brother James II. And James II, now the new king, was very much a professed and earnest Catholic. Um, the new king's great object was now to restore the church, restore England to Catholicism. And he plotted with the king of France, Louis XIV, against the Protestants. And William and Mary become the heroes, the Protestant heroes of the day, of the 17th century. William III of the Netherlands came forward as the champion of Protestantism against Louis XIV and um, James II. His wife Mary was the daughter of James II. Okay, so James II, the King of England, his daughter Mary, and William, who she's married to, take sides against the king. In their distress in England, the Protestants in England appealed to William and Mary. Primarily, they appealed to William. All right, so William was Mary's first cousin, though. William was the son of Mary, the sister of James II. I hope you can follow that. There's two Marys here. William was the son of Mary, the sister of James. Okay, James is the king. His sister Mary, William is that Mary's son, and Mary, who William is married to, is the daughter of the king. All right, so William and Mary are first cousins. But anyway, they ruled as Prince of Orange in Dutch Holland. Accompanied by an army, he crossed the sea from Holland in 1688 and drove out his father-in-law. William and Mary were crowned King and Queen of England, and they ruled jointly. The next year, James made an attempt to regain his throne, supported by a French army, and apparently they went to Ireland. Now, I'm not real clear if Ireland was part of the English rule at this point. I don't think it was, but it became part of or under England's authority sometime in this time frame. But anyway, apparently James was in Ireland with the French army, and the people of Southern Ireland were, the majority of whom were Catholic, took the sides of James. The people of Northern Ireland were Protestants and stood with William, and the battle took place in Ireland. In 1690, the decisive battle took place. James waited on a hill, watching from a distance the battle, and William, on the other hand, showed great courage. Though wounded, he led his soldiers in person, and as a result of his brave and determined stand, William saved Holland, England, and America for Protestantism and liberty against the harsh rule of Louis XIV of France and James II of England. And after this, there were no more wars, which the religious differences between Protestants and Catholics were the main issue, according to the textbook. I'm not 100%. I'm not 100% sure that's a true statement, but I copied it from the textbook.
Okay.
It might be an outdated statement. I probably should delete that from my notes because I'm not real sure about it. William and Mary William and Mary reigned jointly and submitted to Parliament the Bill of Rights. And as far as I know, that's the first Bill of Rights that was ever created. I could be wrong. But a Bill of Rights was submitted by William and Mary, which I'm sure eventually became a model for our Bill of Rights. And of course, granting everybody freedom of religion within reason. There is, I shouldn't say everybody because there is, well, I'll talk about that in a minute. William and Mary reigned over England, Scotland, and Ireland. Okay, so toleration, my last point here. Religious toleration was now granted to all Protestant dissenters. By the Toleration Act of 1689, freedom of worship was granted to most believers. All were to swear an oath of allegiance to the king and queen. Now, this isn't saying that the king and queen are necessarily the head of the church. You didn't have to belong to the Church of England, but you at least needed to acknowledge them as the government head, the head of government, and reject certain Catholic beliefs. Um, so there were certain Catholic beliefs that they strongly objected to. Um, I didn't put that in the notes, but I'm sure it goes into detail in the textbook. Various denominations of Protestant dissenters could exist freely and openly alongside the established Episcopal Church of England. The dissenters, including Presbyterian, Congregationalists, Baptists, and Quakers, formed about 1/10 of the population of England at that time. The Toleration Act did not cover the Roman Catholics and those who denied the Trinity. So apparently, you could be Protestant but not Catholic. So there was a limit to the toleration. They allowed all the dissenters, but they drew a line with Catholicism and those who denied the Trinity. So toleration only goes a certain distance. Any questions about all of this? Next week, if I've started my notes for next week. I'm not 100% sure where we'll go. But I think we're going to be talking about the Baptists and the Quakers and some specific other groups that began to develop in England as well as other places. So, all right, well, let's just close with prayer. Heavenly Father, I just thank you for the privilege of gathering to study your word as well as to study the history of your people. We like to see where the church has come from and where it's going, and we just thank you, Lord, for all the great generals and leaders of Christianity from times past, and allow us to learn what you desire for us to learn from their experiences. And we just thank you, Lord, for what you're showing us in all these things. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Amen. So, I don't know if we're going to work our way through the 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, and I want to save at least a few sessions for the 20th century to talk about Pentecostalism and the healing revivals and the charismatic movement. That's my phone. Oh, I need to turn this off on that.
Then I have a quick question just about something else.